The Königsberg, a German cruiser laying semi-submerged in the muddy waters of the Rufiji River Delta in German East Africa, now Tanzania. But why? On July 11th, 1915, the cruiser was almost completely destroyed by British naval fire. Her only remaining hope for survival was to flee up the river. Unfortunately, the Delta offered Königsberg no safe haven. With the British blockading the main channels, the only option left for the Königsberg was to sink in the river rather than surrender. Today, the wreck rests 20 meters or 65 feet below the water's surface and is covered with sediment, making the ship nearly impossible to see. But first, let's back up a bit and see how the German cruiser came to rest here. After damaging her engines in a skirmish with British ships off the coast of Zanzibar, the Königsberg fled north to the Rufiji Delta, hoping to use the maze of islands and waterways to evade her pursuers. At the time, the Delta was a mysterious place. No European warship had ever ventured into its vast network of channels, and no one was quite sure what dangers lay within. The problem for the Germans was that the Delta was not just a safe haven, but also a tomb. On November 8, 1914, Königsberg reached the Delta and promptly ran aground near the town of Kibaha. After waiting for high tide, which raised the water level just enough for her to float, the ship steamed further up the river to a spot near the present-day Dar es Salaam port. There, in a secluded cove formed by an old coal hulk, a sandbar, and the dense mangrove swamp, the ship anchored. This location was ideal for concealment since the tall trees hid the ship from view, and the swampy waters muffled any noise. The Königsberg was now safely hidden from prying eyes, and it was hoped the British would never find her. While hiding in the Delta, the crew of the Königsberg struggled with disease, dwindling supplies, and a lack of fuel. Tropical diseases such as malaria and typhoid fever swept through the ship's company, weakening the men and lowering morale. Food and water were rationed, and the sailors were forced to drink salt water. Coal was scarce, and without enough fuel, the ship could not escape. To make matters worse, the heavy rains caused the river to rise, making it difficult for any relief ships to reach Königsberg. Despite the bleak situation, the German commanders came up with a plan to get coal to the stranded ship. A merchant vessel named Rubens was disguised as a civilian steamer and loaded with 2,000 tons of coal. The ship set sail for Dar es Salaam, but it was spotted by a British patrol boat and driven back to sea. Undeterred, the Germans tried again with a larger ship, the Kronborg. This time the ruse worked, and the ship successfully delivered the coal. However, the British soon caught on to the trick and began intercepting the supply runs. As the months passed, the Königsberg grew weaker and weaker until the British located her. On July 11, 1915, two British monitors, HMS Mersey and HMS Severn, along with several other ships, entered the Delta and began shelling the German cruiser. Königsberg fought back, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. With her weapons knocked out by the British fire, the captain ordered the ship to be scuttled. At about 2 p.m., the crew placed a final torpedo in the cruiser's bow and detonated it, causing the ship to split in half and quickly sink in the murky water. The Battle of the Rufiji Delta had ended in a decisive British victory, but at what cost? Since the battle, many have tried to find the Königsberg's wreck, but it wasn't until 1980 that a joint Tanzanian-German expedition located the partially buried remains of the ship. Today, the wreck lies 20 meters or 65 feet below the surface, covered in sediment. This has helped preserve the ship, but it also makes it almost impossible to see. So what can we see of the ship today? In 1980, the Tanzanian Navy carried out a series of dives to locate the ship. During these dives, they found parts of the ship's hull, her 105mm guns, and various other equipment. However, the wreck was too deep, and the divers could not bring any of it to the surface. The following year, a German research vessel equipped with sonar scanned the riverbed and located the Königsberg's starboard gun mount. Other searches have found the ship's bell and the remains of her stern. Some of her 105mm guns can still be seen poking out of the ground at the entrance to the old port of Dar es Salaam. One of her guns is on display outside Fort Jesus in Mombasa, Kenya. Another is at a museum in Pretoria, South Africa, and another in Uganda. These relics remind us that even in remote corners of the world, the First World War had profound consequences. It was only a century ago that the mighty cruiser was sailing the open ocean, hunting British ships. And now her guns are scattered around the world as monuments to the conflict. So why does the Battle of the Rufiji Delta matter today? First, the battle demonstrates that war is not just about brute force or military might. Geography, tactics, and endurance are equally important. The British had superior firepower, but they underestimated the challenges of operating in the Delta. The Germans, on the other hand, used their knowledge of the area to conceal and defend their ship. In the end, it was their tenacity and ability to adapt that kept Königsberg afloat for as long as it did. Second, the battle highlights the often overlooked role of the East African campaign in the First World War. While the fighting in Europe is more well known, the conflict in Africa was just as intense and had a major impact on the course of the war. The Germans held on to their colonial possessions in Africa for longer than anywhere else, and they only surrendered in late 1918. The Battle of the Rufiji Delta was just one of many engagements in which colonial troops fought bravely against better-equipped European opponents. Third, the story of the Königsberg shows how, even in defeat, there is always hope for survival. When the ship was cornered in the Delta, her crew refused to surrender. Instead, they fought to the bitter end, destroying the ship and salvaging her guns to continue the fight on land. This spirit of resilience and determination is an important part of human history, and it deserves to be remembered. Lastly, the battle raises questions about the legacy of colonialism and the impact of war on local populations. The Germans exploited the dense vegetation and unfamiliar waterways of the Delta to hide their ship, but this also meant that the local environment was heavily impacted by the fighting. The British used aerial observation and specialized ships to try to locate the Königsberg, but they also caused significant damage to the area. The battle was over in the end, but the effects on the Delta and its inhabitants lingered on. When the Germans landed their artillery pieces on the mainland, they set up shop in the surrounding towns and villages, using civilians as human shields against incoming British artillery fire. After the battle, the locals suffered greatly as a result. As we reflect on the Battle of the Rufiji Delta, we must acknowledge the bravery of those who fought, the ingenuity of the monitors, and the impact the battle had on the region. The story of the Königsberg is a reminder that war is not just a clash of arms, but a complex web of strategy, tactics, geography, and endurance. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other explorations of the First World War. Until next time, happy diving.